Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something I think a lot of you can relate to. How to learn how to work effectively, especially when the usual advice just doesn't quite fit.
Absolutely. We all learn differently, that's clear, but sometimes those differences feel more pronounced, right? Conventional methods can sometimes feel like you're fighting against your own brain.
Exactly. And today we're diving into some really interesting reflections from someone who's navigated school and work, specifically with ADHD. Lots of useful stuff here.
Yeah, it's a great source, offers some really valuable perspectives on, thriving by actually understanding your own way of processing things rather than just trying to force a fit.
That's the goal for this deep dive. Pull out those actionable strategies, those surprising insights. We'll touch on adapting study habits, dealing with different cultural expectations, figuring out your strengths and weaknesses, and really leveraging what makes you unique.
Sounds good. Where
Yeah.
should we start?
Okay, let's jump right in. A really key idea from our source is rethinking learning itself, moving away from just, cramming facts, memorization.
That's a big one. The traditional focus on just memorizing lists of things, it can be a huge hurdle. Our source definitely found that, realized it wasn't working, especially with some of the focus and prioritization challenges that can come with ADHD.
I think everyone's felt that frustration, right? Spending hours trying to memorize something and it just vanishes.
Mhm.
So what was the shift? What worked instead?
Well, the turning point was really shifting focus to using the information, applying it, not just holding it in your head.
Okay, applying it. How does that change how you remember things, though?
It's about understanding the why behind it, the how. When you get the underlying logic, the principles, the details sort of slot into place more naturally, you can reconstruct it by thinking, not just by pure recall.
Ah, okay, so it's less like memorizing a phone number and more like understanding how the phone network works.
Kind of, yeah. It's building a mental framework, not just stacking bricks. And our source also mentioned using notes and tools really strategically.
Right, not just taking notes, but using them differently.
Exactly. Writing things down immediately, especially important details, took the pressure off having to hold everything in memory. It freed up, mental bandwidth for deeper understanding, for actually thinking about the material.
That makes a lot of sense. Working with your brain's limits instead of just battling them, finding workarounds.
Yeah, acknowledging the challenge and getting creative. And this wasn't just for studying, right? This thinking-focused approach paid off elsewhere.
How so?
Well, for problem solving, for creative thinking, in those areas, being able to connect ideas flexibly is way more valuable than just spitting back facts. Memory and prioritizing might still be tricky, but having those strategies makes a huge difference.
Which brings up assessments. Our source found a real difference between types of tests. Struggled with those timed multiple choice exams that are heavy on recall.
Yeah, the classic pressure cooker scenario. Recalling specific details under the clock. Tough.
But contrast that with essay exams.
Totally different experience. When there was space to develop ideas, explain the reasoning, connect the dots, that's where things click. The feedback was often really positive, like, your content is excellent, or that's a unique and profound way of looking at it.
That mismatch is so common. Knowing the subject well, but bombing a specific test format. The takeaway feels like you don't need to ace everything. Focus where you shine.
Precisely. And that leads nicely into the role of environment, of culture. Our source really highlighted the contrast between the US and Japan in this regard.
How do they compare?
Well, generally speaking, there seemed to be more acceptance or at least understanding of different learning styles in the US, whereas in Japan, the emphasis was often much stronger on memory, on following instructions to the letter.
So the U.S. system, maybe by encouraging opinions and discussion, was a better fit for that thinking-based approach.
It seemed that way. It valued expressing your own take. In contrast, the Japanese system, as described, often prioritized recalling exactly what the teacher said, memorizing the model answer. Less room for individuality in the learning process itself.
And you can see how that difference would really impact someone with ADHD traits. Things like thinking outside the box, maybe questioning the standard way, could be strengths in one system and maybe seen less positively in another.
That's a really key point. And it apparently extended beyond school into the work culture in Japan. Lots of talk about diversity, but often the underlying expectation was still about obedience, accuracy, following the established process.
Which our source linked to some potential inefficiencies, right? Things like slow decision-making, sticking to outdated rules, maybe valuing face time over actual productive output.
Yeah, suggesting that maybe a lack of genuine openness to different ways of thinking and working could hold back adaptability, maybe even global competitiveness. It raises questions about how culture shapes not just learning, but innovation too.
Okay, let's shift a bit to the personal challenges and the specific strategies used to cope. This idea of misaligned outcomes really jumped out. Great essays, lower test scores, that's got to be frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. It can create a lot of anxiety, that feeling that your actual understanding isn't being properly measured, and maybe you're missing out because of it.
So what's the insight there? Just accept it.
No, it's more about recognizing the misalignment first. Acknowledging, okay, this specific evaluation method isn't playing to my strengths, and then working to bridge the gap.
Like actively practicing test-taking strategies for those multiple choice exams, or using those notes we talked about to help with specific details.
Exactly. And also, crucially, reminding yourself that the evaluation isn't the whole story. It might just reflect a mismatch with that specific set of criteria, not your overall worth or intelligence.
Our source also talked about putting in tons of effort, like hours in the library, but still not getting the results, both in school and later in a sales job.
Yeah, that disconnect between effort and reward. In the sales role, the focus was on genuinely helping customers, solving their problems, which felt right, felt valuable.
But the company cared more about other things.
Right. The key metrics were maybe profitability per sale or upselling targets, things that didn't perfectly align with just being helpful.
It really highlights that need to understand what's actually being measured, what the expectations are, whether it's a class or a job, and trying to align your efforts, even
The
if your own values point slightly differently sometimes.
And tied into this was a difficulty our source mentioned. Once they believed strongly in a certain way was the right way, it was hard to flexibly change direction.
Like a kind of intense focus or conviction, potentially linked to ADHD traits.
Could be. What's interesting is the self-awareness around it, recognizing that this happens and seeing the need for really clear feedback, maybe visualizing the desired goal to help make those necessary adjustments when your internal compass isn't perfectly aligned with the external one.
Okay, and then there was the concept of useless knowledge. I think we can all relate to falling down an interesting rabbit hole online.
Huh, yes. That tendency to get super absorbed in something fascinating, even if it's not directly related to the task at hand. Hyper-focusing on what's interesting.
Which can lead to procrastination, obviously.
Sure, that's the downside. But the flip side is that deep dives into these areas can lead to unexpected insights or skills later on. It's that hyper-focus associated with ADHD. It has both challenges and potential, sometimes surprising, advantages.
Our source also shared some really specific struggles in a B2B sales role. Things like forgetting key details from client meetings.
Yeah, and finding it hard to listen intently and take good notes at the same time. That simultaneous processing challenge.
What helped with that?
Concrete solutions. Recording meetings to review details later. Preparing super detailed question lists beforehand to stay on track. Even getting colleagues to help with note-taking during important calls. It's about identifying the weak spot and building a support system or process around it.
Very practical. And what about the tendency to talk a lot, maybe go into too much detail?
Ah, yes, the enthusiastic over-explainer. It can come from impulsivity or that same intense focus wanting to share everything.
But it can backfire in meetings, right? Derail things, interrupt people.
It definitely can. So the strategies were about managing it. Consciously identifying the absolute key points before speaking, making a real effort to practice active listening, and working on summarizing concisely. Thinking of it as channeling enthusiasm rather than just shutting it down.
Let's talk about strengths now.
Yeah.
There was that interesting insight from the Gallup StrengthsFinder assessment, realizing that loving the process of learning is actually distinct from achieving specific results with that learning.
Yes, that really struck me. For people driven by curiosity, the joy is often in the discovery itself, in the learning journey.
But that might mean you don't always focus on the destination, the practical application.
Exactly. The satisfaction comes from the learning, maybe more than from the outcome. So the challenge or the opportunity is to consciously build that bridge to link the love of learning to tangible results.
And related to this, maybe, was the difficulty sticking to plans made by other people, that resistance to external instructions.
Right, which can sometimes be an ADHD trait. But Interestingly, this contrasted sharply with an ability to create incredibly detailed, effective plans when it was self-directed, driven by internal motivation.
Like those examples from the beer sales job, developing a whole market strategy for Chicago off his own bat.
Yeah, even when it wasn't official company policy. And that amazing 2-week caravan plan to stretch a tiny travel budget by basically living out of a car and hitting tons of potential clients efficiently. Resourceful.
It shows the power of that internal drive and finding your own way to structure things.
Absolutely. And another key lesson, this one learned from exam failures, was the importance of thinking backward.
Thinking backward. How so?
Instead of just studying everything vaguely hoping it covers the test, it's about starting with the goal. What does success on this specific exam look like? Then working backward to figure out what knowledge and skills are essential and focusing effort there.
So analyzing past exams, identifying the high-yield topics, maybe even eliminating stuff that's unlikely to come up. Much more strategic.
Exactly. It's about stripping away the non-essential. Simplicity. And this tied into note-taking, too, realizing that just passively copying everything down wasn't as helpful as actively engaging, identifying gaps in understanding, maybe summarizing in your own words.
Right, moving from just recording to actual processing.
Mm-hmm.
What about managing passion? That tendency to pour energy into interesting tasks and neglect the boring but necessary ones.
Ah, the classic imbalance. Hyperfocus on the fun stuff. The source listed a bunch of strategies for boosting focus even on the less thrilling but important tasks.
Like what? Give us a few.
Okay. Breaking big goals into tiny, manageable steps. Creating a really conducive work environment. Minimizing distractions. Using time blocking, dedicating specific slots for specific tasks. Visualizing completing the task successfully. Making progress visible, like checklists. Building in small rewards. Trying to find some angle of interest or engagement. Even physical activity breaks. And figuring out your most productive times of day.
That's a whole toolkit.
Yeah.
And how do you harness that initial excitement, that joy of discovering something new, and make sure it actually leads somewhere productive?
Good question. Strategies included consciously linking new learning to solving a specific problem, breaking learning goals down into concrete outputs like, I'll learn this so I can write a summary or build a small prototype, creating personal incentives, adopting that reverse engineering mindset, again, start with what you want to do with the knowledge, collaborating with others, and viewing the application itself as another learning opportunity.
Okay, let's widen the lens again to the bigger picture education systems. Support. The contrast between the U.S. and Japan regarding ADHD came up again.
Yeah, it's significant. The source felt support was more normalized in the U.S., less potential stigma compared to Japan. And the U.S. focus on personalized learning, encouraging students to express their own ideas, seemed more accommodating.
And the perception itself, viewing ADHD more as a collection of traits in the U.S. versus perhaps more strictly as a disability in Japan.
That seemed to be the observation. Also, differences in societal views on raising kids, maybe a more collective sense of responsibility in the U.S. using school bus safety rules as a small example.
The source was also a bit critical of some changes in Japan seeming superficial, like rules about jackets for the school marathon, while maybe deeper issues or outdated rules persist.
Right. It feeds into that broader call to see individual differences like ADHD traits, not just as deficits, but as potential strengths, and to build systems, educational and workplace, that are genuinely more inclusive and flexible.
Which points towards things like personalized learning methods being key,
Oh.
especially for neurodivergent individuals, mentioning things like the Pomodoro technique, mind maps, tools that structure work differently.
Exactly. And the personal story of only recognizing ADHD in college and that shift from self-blame, why can't I just do this, to understanding, my brain works differently now, how can I work with it? That's such a crucial turning point.
And acknowledging the real challenges, forgetting lecture content almost immediately, getting pulled into fascinating but irrelevant tangents during study sessions, understanding something but just not retaining it easily.
Yeah, those are common experiences. Which leads to the point about disclosure in the workplace. The idea that talking about ADHD isn't necessarily admitting weakness, but can actually be a way to foster understanding, get necessary accommodations, and find roles that better suit your strengths. It's about enabling clear communication.
It seems the overarching message is that living well with ADHD or any significant learning difference is really about finding those tailored approaches. It's not about being fixed, but about developing personalized strategies.
And recognizing that these different ways of thinking can be genuine sources of creativity, resilience, and unique perspectives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaways really seem to be the power of truly understanding your own unique learning and working style, recognizing the huge impact of your environment and the surrounding culture, and knowing there are practical strategies you can use to play to your strengths and navigate the challenges.
Absolutely. Thriving isn't about forcing yourself into a pre-made mold. It's about that deeper self-understanding, figuring out how you're wired, and then building your life and work around that intelligently.
So a final thought for you, the listener,
Hmm.
based on everything we've talked about, was maybe one small shift, one tiny experiment you could try in your own approach to learning or work this week. We really encourage you to embrace your own kind of deep dive into figuring out what works best for you.